Hi, I'm Professor Ron Wixman, and this is the last of the videos on the Ukraine-Russia crisis. In my first one and my second and third, I talked about general background. Today, I'm going to talk about more specifically why Ukrainians came to hate Moscow. And I want to stress this. This is clearly an issue that has gotten worse and worse over time and has a lot to do with why Ukrainians decided to break with Moscow. If we look at Ukraine at the time of the Russian Revolution, I commented on this. For every one Ukrainian, there were only 3 Russians. In the last census, which was 1989, for every Ukrainian, there were 5 Russians. How is it that Ukrainians declined so greatly in number? I also pointed out that Russians have increased between 1950 and 1989. Russians increased by 62% in Ukraine, and Ukrainians by only 8%, with many, many Ukrainians being outside. That's what I want to explain today. At the end of the Russian Revolution, when Lenin finally gave in to the idea that there was no socialist workers' revolution, it was defeated, and it was an ethno-national war with the major nationalities demanding rights, and Lenin saying that every nationality would be given their ethnic, linguistic, cultural, etc. rights to the point that they'd be allowed to secede. All of them did. Stalin becomes a leader because he's a non-Russian, non-Jew, and he was Commissar of Nationalities. This is often overlooked in the West. Why Stalin? Stalin was a brute. Lenin knew it. And in fact, Lenin basically said he wanted Stalin eliminated, and perhaps the reverse took place first. One of the first things that was done was a massive purge of the Ukrainian leaders that had supported the communists under the title that they were bourgeois nationalists. At that time, there was a continuation of the view that Ukrainian is a peasant language and that Russian is the real language of the region. Education was stressed in Russian, but this wasn't so bad. The Ukraine had a very large Cossack population. Cossacks were the Slavs that had run away from serfdom and took on a lifestyle of the Tatars. They became cattlemen, and they were ordered into, in their own structure, military bands that were militarized and armed. This is critical to understand. Stalin needed to eliminate the Cossacks, and not just Ukrainian Cossacks, but Russian Cossacks as well, because they stood in his way. They could threaten the government. Now, in the southern steppes, there were major Cossack populations. Stalin came up with one of the most brilliant ideas in history, totally evil, but brilliant. He decided to collectivize. Now, in the West, it was put as to reorganize agriculture and make life better. It was nice of American leftists to fall for that drivel. However, and I remember reading about this, that it was just unbelievable after you read the facts of what happened. In the name of reorganizing and taking the land from the Cossacks and the foreign owners that they would be given to the peasants, Stalin came up with the following idea. Requisition the grain produced, and Ukraine and the Northern Caucasus were the world's leading producers of grain. Requisition it, and he brought on a famine. It is estimated that 9 million people in the former Soviet Union, mostly in Ukraine and in the North Caucasus, died during this period of famine. At the same time, Stalin is telling the West, look at how wonderful our grain production is, that we have such a surplus, we're selling it to you. But the left decided to believe the drivel anyway because it fit their paradigm of the Soviet Union and communism being workers' paradise. Here's what Stalin did. He sold abroad to buy technology and to get money. He then accused the Cossacks and free farmers, that is, the people who owned land, of being capitalists and having starved the country. Therefore, they were to be punished. So he seized all of their lands. Those lands were not given to the peasants, but turned into state farms, where the peasants simply became peasants for the state instead of peasants for the landowners. Now, what then happened was millions died. It's estimated that somewhere between 3 and 6 million Ukrainians died as a result. This did not win Stalin and the communists many whoopee points among Ukrainians. Then many were shipped off to the new mines, new industrial areas of the Urals, Siberia, etc. What do you think you would do when the Nazis invaded? Think about it. Would you still be loyal to Stalin and the Communist Party after being starved, your country ravaged, and people killed? Stalin had a pact with Hitler signed in 1939 called the Non-Aggression Pact. And this again is overlooked by the West. We talk about, World War II, and Hitler invaded Danzig. Nice, a German city that had been transferred to Poland. What is overlooked is that according to that pact, Stalin could go back to the borders of the Russian Empire at the beginning of World War I, meaning Stalin and the communists could retake Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, 53% of the land of Poland, and Moldova from Romania. And this area included the Western Ukraine. We hear about how many Soviets died in World War II. That's nonsense. Yes, 28 million people died. 40% were from Ukraine. Belarus lost 1/4 of its population. 5 million of those are Jews. And we're not even talking about Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. What is remembered is that under this pact, Stalin had the entire military leadership of Poland, approximately 48,000 people, massacred in a forest. So this was a brilliant move by Hitler. Signing this pact, Stalin moves into this area of Western borderlands between the Germans and the Russians, and he has a purge of the leadership of the Baltic states, etc., this entire area. This is all now chalked up to Nazis, which is nonsense. We don't know what proportion were killed by the Germans and what by the Soviets, but here was the brilliance of Hitler. Had the Nazi army simply invaded, these countries would have prepared for war, and Stalin would have been able to prepare for war. Instead, they were brutalized by Stalin, so that when the Nazis invaded, these peoples overwhelmingly, as you would have or I would have, sided with Hitler as a liberator. So at the end of the war, these areas were reincorporated into the Soviet Union. They had lost massive populations, which is the 26 million people, only some of which were Russians, and those areas were not part of the Soviet Union at the time. At the end of the war, Stalin then purged all of these areas. Millions of Ukrainians, Balts, Belarusians, Moldovans, etc., were transferred out of the country. And then Stalin imposed in all of these areas a Russian-only policy and higher levels throughout the country. Throughout Ukraine, all ties with Russia historically were played up. Ukrainians did not write the real history of Ukraine, nor did anyone else. What happened was Moscow seized control of every aspect of life. Ukrainians resented it bitterly. During this time, with the massive industrialization, Stalin needed more labor in Siberia, in the Urals, etc. And then in the 1950s and 60s, millions of Ukrainians were induced either by higher salaries or because the areas they came from had been devastated, or more, that they had been shipped out. At the same time that Ukrainians are moving to Siberia, we have Russians moving into eastern Ukraine and more so to Crimea to seize the lands that were economically so valuable. Today, we have this system where, or rather, excuse me, just before the Soviet Union collapsed, throughout eastern Ukraine, no Ukrainian language schools, papers, etc. were available. Ukrainians began to get very angry. In my last talk, I mentioned that even the Russians, disease. There were people in Ukraine walking around with t-shirts with a picture. On the left side was Putin, on the right side of the face was Hitler, and it said Putler, Putin and Hitler. Isn't it interesting that Ukrainians years ago started conflating Putin with Nazis? Notice what is Putin calling Ukrainians today? Is it sort of an interesting about face? It is Putin that's the Nazi, and that's tied to Hitler in the eyes of Ukrainians. So there.